There is a signal coming from deep space right now, a steady, patient tone from a machine millions of kilometers away. And here's the strange part. NASA knows exactly what it is. They know who built it. They know the day it launched. They know exactly what it is asking for. There is just one problem. For years, nobody on Earth could answer it. Not because the probe was too far away, not because it was broken, not because it was too quiet. It was because NASA had thrown away the only equipment on the entire planet that could talk back to it. So the signal just kept coming, year after year after year, a machine calling home to a world that had forgotten how to pick up the phone. This is the story of a spacecraft called ISEE-3. NASA switched it off. They gave it away to a museum while it was still flying, and they forgot it existed. Then, 36 years after it launched, someone finally answered. It just was not NASA. It was a team of volunteers, and they did it out of an abandoned McDonald's. I know how that sounds. So let me start at the beginning, because before this machine was forgotten, it was one of the biggest overachievers NASA ever built. It launched on August 12, 1978. Back then, it had a boring name, ISEE-3, and what sounded like a boring job, fly out to a special point between the Earth and the Sun and watch the solar wind. That point is called L1. It sits about 1.5 million kilometers from Earth. It is the exact spot where the pull of our planet and the pull of the Sun cancel out. So a spacecraft parked there can basically hover in place and stare at the Sun with nothing in the way. It is the perfect early warning post for incoming solar storms. Today, there is a whole fleet of satellites guarding that exact spot. But ISEE-3 was the first spacecraft in history to orbit L1. It basically invented the idea, and that job matters more than it sounds. The solar wind is a constant stream of charged particles blasting off the Sun. And when the Sun throws a real tantrum, a big enough storm can fry satellites, scramble GPS, even knock out power grids on the ground. Parked out at L1, a probe gets roughly a 1-hour head start to see that storm coming before it slams into Earth. ISEE-3 was the machine that proved you could even stand guard out there. But that was only the warm-up. Because a few years later, NASA looked at this little solar wind probe and had a genuinely wild idea. What if they sent it to chase a comet? No spacecraft had ever visited a comet, not once, not in all of human history. The problem was that ISEE-3 was parked way out at L1 in completely the wrong place for that. So the engineers did something that still sounds insane. Between 1982 and 1983, they flew the probe through a series of incredibly precise loops around the moon. 5 separate lunar flybys. Each one used the moon's gravity like a slingshot. Each pass bent its path a little more. It was orbital billiards played across hundreds of thousands of kilometers. And the final moon pass in December 1983 skimmed just 119 kilometers above the lunar surface. That is lower than some airliners fly here on Earth. Except this was over the moon, moving at thousands of kilometers an hour. They threaded that needle perfectly, and they gave the probe a new name. It became ICE, the International Cometary Explorer. On 9/11, 1985, it made history. ISEE-3 flew straight through the tail of a comet called giacobini-zinner. It passed about 7,800 kilometers from the icy nucleus. It punched right through the comet's glowing plasma tail, and it took measurements nobody had ever taken. It was the first spacecraft ever to reach a comet. And this was not some safe little drive-by. Flying through a comet's tail means flying through a stream of dust and ice at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour. A single grain the size of a sand particle can punch a hole clean through you. It was a real gamble, and the probe survived it. And here's the kicker. There was a whole international armada of famous expensive spacecraft being built at that exact moment to visit Halley's Comet. Europe's Giotto. 2 Soviet Vega probes. 2 separate Japanese missions, all of them aimed at Halley. Years in the making. And this rebranded 1970 solar wind satellite quietly slipped in and reached a comet first. It beat the entire armada by about 6 months. It even went on to fly past Halley itself in 1986. So by the mid-1980s, ISEE-3 was not some forgotten piece of junk. It was a legend, a record breaker, which makes what NASA did to it next honestly hard to believe. By 1997, the mission was old. The big science was finished. So on May 5th, 1997, NASA officially shut the mission down. But they did something strange. They left the transmitter switched on. And the thing is, the probe was still perfectly healthy, still flying, still broadcasting. It cost almost nothing to keep going because it ran on sunlight. NASA just stopped listening. And then it got stranger. They formally donated the spacecraft to the Smithsonian Museum. Stop and picture that for a second. A museum piece. A historical artifact officially signed over to the nation's museum. Except this artifact was not sitting behind glass in a quiet hall. It was still out there, still alive, still flying through deep space, tens of millions of kilometers from home, quietly doing its job. And then it got worse. In 1999, the probe swung behind the sun, and NASA quietly closed the old Goddard Control Center that used to talk to it. And here is the single detail this whole story turns on. The special radio equipment that the Deep Space Network needed to speak to ISEE-3 on its specific old 1970s frequency was scrapped, decommissioned, physically thrown out. So even if NASA had suddenly wanted to call the probe, they no longer had the machinery to do it. The ability to answer it was not just forgotten, it was deleted from the face of the Earth. And the reason behind all of this was painfully ordinary. It was money. Keeping that specialized gear running and paying people to track an old probe with no active mission cost real money every single year. Budgets get cut, priorities move on to the next big thing. So a quiet decision got made. This particular piece of history was not worth the price of keeping the line open. Nobody stopped to imagine they might one day want to call it back. But the probe had no clue, it just kept doing its job. Every few years, someone would get curious and point a big antenna at it just to see. Once in 1999, again in 2008, and every single time the answer came back the same. It was still there, still transmitting a strong, clear signal. In that 2008 check, 12 of its 13 instruments were still working. 12 out of 13. After 30 years in space. This was a completely functional spacecraft calling home to a planet that had thrown away the phone. For 17 years, that is how it sat. Ignored, but alive. Until a small group of hobbyists decided to do something completely ridiculous. Here is the thing about ISEE-3's orbit. That path the engineers designed back in 1983 was not random. It was a giant loop around the sun, and that loop was always going to bring the probe back around to the neighborhood of Earth. In 2014, it was basically an appointment scheduled 30 years in advance, and a few clever people realized that 2014 was a once-in-a-generation chance. As the probe swung close to home, there might be a narrow window to grab it, to catch it, maybe even to bring it back for good. It was March 1st, 2014. A team of amateur radio operators in Bochum, Germany, pointed a 20-meter dish toward the incoming probe. These were not NASA engineers. These were volunteers, part of a group called AMSAT. And they found it. They picked up the faint carrier signal of ISEE-3, coming in right where the orbital math said it would be, still faithfully broadcasting after 36 years. Let that actually land. The people who first proved this abandoned NASA spacecraft was alive and reachable were not NASA. They were hobbyists with a backyard-scale radio setup, and that discovery lit a fuse under a much bigger idea, because a small group of engineers and space nerds heard about it and decided to attempt the impossible. They were going to fly it. They were going to command a NASA spacecraft that NASA itself could no longer talk to. They called themselves the ISEE-3 Reboot Project. It was led by an engineer named Dennis Wingo and a space journalist named Keith Cowing. And their headquarters is honestly my favorite detail in this entire story. They set up shop inside an abandoned derelict McDonald's on the grounds of NASA's own Ames Research Center in California. They nicknamed it McMoons, a shut-down, gutted burger restaurant, packed with borrowed and donated vintage gear, running as live mission control for a real spacecraft in deep space. They did not have a NASA budget, so they raised the money themselves, almost $160,000, crowdfunded from the general public on a website called Rocket Hub. It was one of the first space missions in history paid for by ordinary people on the internet. And to its real credit, NASA did something it had never done in its entire history. It signed a formal Space Act agreement. It handed operational control of an actual spacecraft over to a group of private citizens. That had never happened before. Not one single time. But then they slammed into the real wall. To send commands to ISEE-3, you needed 1970s hardware. Very specific, very old transmitters that matched the probe's original system. And that hardware simply did not exist anymore. Not in a warehouse. Not in museum, nowhere on Earth. NASA had scrapped it, remember? And nobody had built one in decades. The team even had to dig up faded, decades-old technical documents just to understand how the probe expected to be spoken to. And then they did something genuinely brilliant. Instead of hunting for dead hardware, they rebuilt it in software. They wrote a program using something called software-defined radio and a free tool called GNU Radio. It could perfectly imitate those long-dead 1970s machines. A digital ghost of equipment that had been rotting in a scrapyard for 15 years. And then they loaded that ghost onto one of the largest radio telescopes on the planet, the 305-meter giant dish at Arecibo in Puerto Rico. Think about what that actually means. They did not repair the old machine, they resurrected it as pure code, a piece of software pretending to be a stack of dead 1970s electronics, convincing enough to fool a real spacecraft that had no idea its original hardware had been gone for years, and on May 29, 2014, it worked. Two-way contact. After 17 years of total silence from Earth's side, someone finally answered, ISEE-3, a team of volunteers, in a broken-down fast food restaurant, funded by strangers on the internet, using a radio that only existed as code, and the probe answered them right back. It had been waiting the whole time, and they did the entire thing out in the open. The reboot was public. People all over the world followed along online. They watched a ragtag team bring a dead NASA spacecraft back to life in real time, from a building that used to sell cheeseburgers. For a few genuinely incredible weeks in 2014, a crowd-funded group of volunteers was actively flying a probe through deep space, and against every reasonable expectation, it was working. And it was not just beeps and static. They pulled real data straight off the spacecraft. They checked its systems, and they confirmed what those earlier peaks had only hinted at. Most of the probe was still in remarkably good shape, after 17 years of being ignored. This was not a corpse they had reached out and touched. It was a survivor. Now the team had a real concrete dream. The probe was racing toward that close pass with Earth and the Moon, and they ran the numbers. If they could fire its engines just a little at exactly the right moment, they could nudge it into a stable orbit near Earth. They could actually bring this piece of living history home. So on July 2nd, 2014, they sent up the command to fire the thrusters. These were engines that had been sitting frozen and unused in the deep cold of space for 27 years. Nobody knew if they would even respond, and they fired. They actually worked. The probe spun up right on cue, exactly as designed. It was really happening, so they held their breath and went for the main event. On July 8th, they went for the big one, the long burn that would actually reshape its path and pull it toward home. And it failed. The engines coughed, they sputtered, they quit. And the reason was almost stupidly simple. The nitrogen gas that pressurized the fuel tanks was completely gone. Its only job was to push the propellant into the engines, and it was empty. Without that pressure, the fuel just could not flow. Here is the cruel little twist. The probe still had plenty of actual fuel on board. It just had no way left to push any of it. 36 years in space, and it ran out of the one thing nobody thought to worry about. There would be no rescue. ISEE-3 was going to sail right past its own home, and there was nothing anyone on Earth could do to stop it. And on August 10th, 2014, it did. It swept past the moon at around 15,000 kilometers, and here is the part that genuinely gives me chills. It arrived exactly where it was supposed to be. It hit that lunar flyby dead on target. It followed a trajectory that engineers had drawn up for it back in the early 1980s. 3 decades of drifting silently through space, completely ignored. And it still showed up for its appointment right on time. Then it simply kept going, sliding back out into its long orbit around the sun. And on September 16th, 2014, contact was lost for good. The reboot team had run out of both time and money. ISEE-3 went quiet again, awake for a few short, glorious months, then abandoned for a second time. But here is why this story is not actually over. ISEE-3 did not crash, it did not break, it did not burn up, it simply flew back out into its long looping orbit around the sun, exactly as physics said it would. And as far as anyone knows, it is still out there right now, still structurally healthy. In those final months of contact, its signal showed it was very much alive. Several of its instruments were still faithfully running, which means it is quite possibly still transmitting at this very moment, still calling home into a sky where, once again, almost nobody is listening. And its orbit brings it back. That same loop that returned it in 2014 is swinging it around for another pass. Trajectory studies say ISEE-3 is due to return to the neighborhood of Earth toward the end of this decade, somewhere around 2029 to 2031. The exact year depends on whose math you trust, but there is one last strange twist waiting in that return. The giant Arecibo dish is gone. It was the single most powerful tool that made the entire 2014 rescue possible. It collapsed in 2020 and had to be demolished, so the one instrument that let us answer ISEE-3 the last time no longer even exists. When this probe comes knocking again at the end of the decade, we might have to figure out how to talk to it all over again, from scratch. And whatever happens next, ISEE-3 already left a mark that will outlive the mission. It became the first spacecraft ever handed over to private citizens, the first ever flown on a crowd-funded budget, and living proof that a machine written off as junk can be woken back up decades later by a few people who simply refuse to let it go. So somewhere out there, a nearly 50-year-old spacecraft is quietly making its way back toward us one more time. A spacecraft that NASA forgot, that hobbyists tracked down and revived from an abandoned McDonald's. That slipped through our fingers at the very last second. It answered us once, on the day we finally bothered to call. The only real question left is whether anyone on Earth will be ready to pick up when it comes knocking again in a few short years. If this got you, you need to hear what is happening to Voyager right now. The probe's still calling home from interstellar space, and the 3 separate times that it was us who went silent. Not the probe. That video is on your screen. Go watch it. and I will see you in the next one.